exist in C-71. But first, Mr. Speaker, I'd again like to bring up the debate has, the whole debate about a bill that has questionable evidence attached to it, and we have yet to hear from the minister, who is responsible for the RCMP, that after they were found in contempt of Parliament, while he may ignore members of Parliament and thousands of law-abiding Canadians, the Assembly of First Nations, and the police, I'd like to think that a censure from this House and the Speaker would result in some action that is yet to occur. As you know, on June 19th, the Speaker ruled that the RCMP's implementation of C-71, and I quote, "The vast majority of the information presented as though the provisions will definitively become into force and effect are already in law of the land. Nowhere did I find any indication that the bill was in committee and was not yet enacted law." Further, the Speaker added, "The work of members as legislators is fundamental, and any hint of suggestion of the parliamentary role and authority being bypassed or usurped is not acceptable." The RCMP presumed the will of Parliament. They assumed the bill would pass and attempted to enforce the new rules before any decisions came from committee, the House, or the Senate. While addressing his attempt to undermine Canada's democracy, the Minister of Public Safety continued to pass a bill based on false information, despite the concerns of millions of Canadians and many members of Parliament. And these concerns are raised by Conservative members on this side of the House, expert testimony, written submissions, the media, my own consultations across the country, and ultimately confirmed by Liberal MPs on the committee. This is bad legislation, flawed from its start, and based on misleading information that attempted to pull the wool over the eyes of Canadians. The Minister of Public Safety has made questionable comments regarding this bill. Recently in the House of Commons, the Minister tabled a list of the organizations that were formally consulted on C-71. To date, 7 of those individuals or organizations have already come forward to say that they were not consulted. The Assembly of First Nations, for example, has stated that they weren't consulted and that this legislation is an infringement on their treaty rights. The Liberal MP from Ajax, who was the Parliamentary Secretary at the time, made the outright claim that national consultations were held, and he stated in this House, and I quote, "Discussions in every corner of this country, including with First Nations chiefs, chiefs of police, the firearms community, and others," end of quote. But I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister has never set foot in any of my communities to hold consultations. But I can tell you from my own consultations with Canadians across the country, they are very concerned that there's nothing in this bill that deals with criminals, with gang violence, or illegal firearms. There are only more rules for law-abiding Canadians, and they're very angry about that. The consultations, if they actually did happen, were done poorly. As one stakeholder told me, "If I was consulted, I think I would know about it." In the height of the irony, the Minister held a summit on gangs and guns. It was clear that the issue brought forward by those experts was not around law-abiding gun owners. It is with organized crime, with gangs, and with violent criminals. So not only did the Liberals not listen to those who were impacted by the bill, they almost entirely ignored what experts said was the problem in Canada. And that's gangs, organized crime, and gun violence. Now, experts from across the country told us about a whole host of crime issues at that summit. They discussed illegal firearms, primarily handguns, straw purchases, stealth shipping, and gangs. But still the Minister came to the Committee of Public Safety and National Security with false and inaccurate information. He appeared before the committee, and I quote, "While crime rates in Canada overall have been on the decline, thankfully for decades, the rate of gun violence has been going up recently, in recent years. Between 2013 and 2016, the number of incidents involving firearms rose by 30%. Gun homicides in that period went up by 2/3. Intimate partner gender-based violence involving firearms was up by 1/3. Gang-related homicides, most of which involved guns, were up by 2/3. Break and enters for the purpose of stealing firearms were up by 56% between 2013 and 2016, and by a whopping 865% since the year 2008. End of quote. Wow, that sounds like we have a real crisis. But we should look at what experts said about his misrepresentation of the information. Solomon Friedman, from the Criminal Trial Lawyers Association of Canada, had this to say: "The Criminal Trial Lawyers Association supports criminal law reform that is modest," and I'm quoting, "fundamentally rational and supported by objective evidence. On each of these measures, Bill C-71, in our view, fails to meet the mark. First, the proposed reforms of C-71 are unsupported by evidence. In fact, In presenting its rationale for this bill, the government has misrepresented the objective statistical data to create the appearance of a problem that simply does not exist. As a society, we are poorer for it when government promotes criminal legislation on a misunderstanding, or worse yet, on a willful manipulation of what claims to be empirical evidence. On May 8th, the Honourable, and I continue to quote, the Honourable Minister of Public Safety, Ralph Goodale, told the committee that between 2013 and 2016, the number of criminal incidents involving firearms rose by 30%. Gun homicides in that period went up by 2/3. Those numbers are alarming. They give the clear impression that gun crime and homicide by firearm specifically are a rampant and increasing problem in our society. Mr. Solomon went on to suggest that with the greatest respect to the minister, that is simply not the case. The year 2013, the starting point for the purported trend, was not chosen at random. As we know, 2013 was a statistical aberration in terms of violent crime and homicide in Canada. 2013 saw the lowest rate of violent crime in Canada in 50 years. To put that in perspective, every year since 1966 has been worse than 2013. So it's not surprising that the 3 years following 2006 or 13 would be also worse. The truth of the matter is homicide by firearm has in fact been steadily declining in Canada since the mid-1970s. And when an appropriate size sample is taken, the alarming trend the minister purported to identify is seen for what it is, a selective manipulation of statistical data. The rate of homicide by firearm, when viewed over a more reasonable sample size, has remained relatively stable. In fact, it was slightly lower in 2016 than it was 10 years earlier in 2006. Mr. Speaker, here we have a criminal defense lawyer destroying the highly questionable evidence provided by the minister. That is shocking, disappointing, and it should be very alarming to Canadians. The minister also said that there's an 865% increase in break and enter and stealing of firearms since 2008. Interesting stat, it's true. However, what the minister failed to identify is that in 2008, the Conservatives brought in a law, specifically you can break and enter and steal a firearm as a specific offense. Never occurred before. It was a break and enter and theft before, and that's how it was covered off. So we never really had a new offense occurring, something just starting out. The minister was misleading information again. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, we heard from a Dr. Gary Mauser at committee about the information the minister presented as facts. He said that 121 of the 141 increased firearms-related homicides were directly related to gangs in cities. So the rate of violence in Canada is because there are more gangs and gang-related shootings. And surprisingly, the word gangs appears nowhere in the bill, Mr. Speaker. So it appears the minister's increasing stats on gun violence are really just selective use of figures and wrongfully attributed to licensed, law-abiding gun owners. So what happens when a professor from a trustworthy Canadian university provides evidence contrary to the government's flawed legislation and position? Well, they do what they always do. They call into question their credibility. The reality, Mr. Speaker, is that Canadians all across this country are rightfully beginning to question the credibility of this Liberal government. Minister Goodale went on to say at committee, right now, when a person applies for a license, and I'm quoting, there is a mandatory look back over the immediately preceding 5 years to see whether they have in that period of time been engaged in any violent behavior or treated for any mental illness associated with violence. Bill C-71 will remove that 5-year limitation so that a person's entire record will be taken into account. That will help ensure, quite simply, that people with a history of violence do not get guns. End of quote. Again, Mr. Speaker, this is an inaccurate statement. The minister's own officials from the Canadian Firearms Program and the RCMP confirmed that criminal background checks were never limited and are never limited to 5 years. All in any criminal history is taken into account, no matter how old it is. So either the minister is ignoring his own experts or is just presenting misleading information to justify a pointless piece of legislation. The minister went on to say at committee, and I quote, the legislation will also help ensure that people who acquire firearms are actually licensed to own them. Since 2012, all that has been required in this regard at the time of the sale is that the vendor have no reason to believe that the purchaser is not licensed. Vendors often check anyway, but in fact, they are not required to do so. Again, Mr. Speaker, that statement is blatantly false. Legal experts at committee told us the following, and I quote, any violation, no matter how minor or technical, engages the criminal law process. Indeed, this legislation creates new criminal offenses where none were needed. For example, C-71 will make it an offense for a firearm owner to transfer a firearm, meaning to give, sell, or barter to another person without first obtaining a reference number from the registrar of the firearms. Let me be clear, this expert said, it is already a criminal offense to transfer a firearm to an individual who is not authorized to possess it. Section 101 of the Criminal Code prohibits this precise conduct. It is punishable by a maximum of 5 years in prison. The government says that the new provisions under C-71 are required to ensure that firearms are not transferred without lawful authority. Not surprisingly, the existing offense in Section 101 that I just mentioned is entitled transfer without authority. However, under Bill C-71, one law-abiding licensed firearm owner can transfer a firearm to another law-abiding licensed firearm owner and still commit a criminal offense if the government is not duly notified. This does nothing more than create another trap for the unwary, a trap that carries with it criminal consequences. And this expert said, and for what purpose? It is not for the actual appearance or the actual public safety, it's for the appearance of public safety. So it's clear to me, Mr. Speaker, end of quote, by the way, it's clear to me, Mr. Speaker, that the minister knew that what he was saying was inaccurate, and that he likely knew his bill would do nothing for public safety. And he is not alone in misleading statements and false statements. The Prime Minister himself tweeted out early on in the introduction of C-71, we're introducing stronger and more rigorous background checks on sales. And if you buy a gun, by law, you'll have to show a license at the point of purchase. Right now, that's not a requirement. Really? That's exactly what the law is now. So we know where the minister or the Prime Minister is getting the information. Obviously, it's not factual. In the fall of 2017, Mr. Goodale made an announcement in Surrey, BC, where there is a real gun problem. Gun violence and shootings there are a regular occurrence. Police and communities across our country need more help to tackle these criminals. So at the time, he made this $327 $1 million to combat guns and gangs. A great announcement, and no doubt one that would help the Liberal MP from Surrey White Rock secure his seat as it was made during a by-election. To date, though, Canadians should understand that not one dime has moved on to that funding. And it'll take a full 2 years for the Liberals to make that funding available to police. So since that announcement, the Liberals have tabled now C-71, pushed the House by limiting debate and testimony, and ramming it through without almost no amendments, despite nearly every witness saying it wasn't a good bill. Mr. Speaker, it is no surprise, I guess, that the Liberal MPs on this committee were expected to limit debate as much as possible. In fact, we had more testimony from department officials, 21 to be exact, than from Canadians and stakeholder groups. There were over 100 submitted briefs to committee from organizations and people who could not appear, but were trying to show that law-abiding firearm owners were not the problem. In fact, my office received 30 submissions after the committee was required to submit their amendments. That means dozens of organizations and individuals who put time and effort into their briefs received no consideration in this debate, none. So, Mr. Speaker, let's summarize some of the key issues I've heard from Canadians all across this country, including the over 86,000 who signed the petition that was presented yesterday opposed to C-71. First, this bill does nothing to tackle gun and gang crime. Nothing. Criminals do not follow the law and do not register their guns. Secondly, the claims by this minister, his parliamentary secretary, the Prime Minister, and the rest of the Liberals that this will go after criminals while respecting firearm owners are inaccurate and, in fact, insulting to the millions of Canadians. Third, the Liberals won't call this a gun registry. The rest of the country thinks it's a gun registry, and I guess we'll leave it to them to decide in the 2019 election. Finally, we saw what Liberal MPs really thought of Bill C-71 when they finished this bill discussion at committee. Moments after ratifying this legislation at committee, Liberal MPs were calling for a study raised by witnesses. They called the minister to address real issues facing illegal firearms getting into the hands of criminals, administrative and process issues resulting in firearms or criminals getting firearm licenses. They called for more stats and research into gun violence and criminal acquisitions of firearms. Well, those are great issues. Fantastic things, and they're certainly a lot more productive than what was in Bill C-71 that the minister put forward. But however, none of them had the courage during the debate on C-71 to bring those issues forward when we had a chance to change that legislation at that time. So this summer, after more gang shootings, will the government now take a hard look at the real issues, the evidence, and the problem? Is the new minister empowered to go after criminals and illegal weapons and repair the relationship with millions of law-abiding Canadians? Sadly, the answer is no. Rather, the Liberals are now taking their previous mistakes and repeating them with an investigation into handgun ban. While I understand that the government prefers to look like it's doing something as opposed to actually addressing the issues, Canadians deserve better. A Canadian Press article highlighted the government's justification for going after law-abiding gun owners, claiming a surge in crime guns, suggesting about 1/2 of crime guns in Toronto originated from lawful licensed gun owners. But the comments and the article were lacking in detail and statistical evidence, and had many experts and advocates questioning those results. Albertan Dennis Young, a former RCMP officer and a public servant, submitted a Freedom of Information request to obtain actual Toronto Police Service stats. Well, guess what? Their stats show a very different reality. The number of crime guns seized was on a downward trend over the last 10 years.
Surprising.
The number of domestically sourced firearms down over the last 10 years. There was no surge, as the minister and others have said, and as noted by the media outlets, the overall trend for crime guns in Toronto is down. So the crisis is more manufactured than based on fact.
Yep.
And the number of firearms being traced back to their origins is very small, too small for us to have good information, and shows that the government is failing Canadians on public safety if police don't have the resources necessary to trace back the firearms that they seize to their origins. To quote a global news commentary about the handgun ban, and I quote, "Politicians, including the Prime Minister and Toronto Mayor John Tory, who once strongly opposed a ban on handguns, are either considering or actively calling for one. This would be a major change to the criminal code, involving potentially billions of dollars on private property. It is not an exaggeration to say the Canadian press is the key part of this debate. Do our political leaders, continuing the quote, do our political leaders know they're reacting to a story with bad information? Perhaps the most depressing question is whether they'd care if they did." End of quote. Perhaps the Liberals are interested in listening to what senior and experienced law enforcement officials are saying. Mike McCormick from the Toronto Police Association said, and I quote, "There is no way in my world or in any world I know of that this," referring to the handgun ban, "would have an impact on somebody who's going to go out and buy an illegal gun and use it to kill another person." End of quote. Newly minted Commissioner Brenda Lucki, appointed by the very minister in charge of this bill and who we would like to assume he counts on for advice, has no proof that a handgun ban does anything to protect the public. She said, "I'm not sure if a complete ban is the answer or tweaking the legislation." End of quote. Ontario Provincial Police's former chief quoted, said, and I quote, "It would be unmanageable and unfair to the majority of handgun owners who obey the law and always use their guns safely. Let's effectively deal with the criminals that do not obey the current criminal law." End of quote. In Surrey, BC, a former police officer running for City Council indicated, and this is Surrey, indicated that from his experience, and I quote, "a ban will have little effect on decreasing gang violence in our community." End of quote. Now, pointing out that the Liberal plan completely lacks any credibility doesn't mean we on this side don't see issues that we face in this country. But the government's practice of blaming hunters, blaming farmers for the criminal actions of gangs and criminals is wrong. It's morally wrong and it's factually wrong. It's time, Mr. Speaker, that this Liberal government started taking public safety and their duty to protect Canadians seriously. Canada has real problems. Criminals are the center of our gun violence problems, not hunters, not sport shooters, not farmers. Canadians deserve a government that supports all law-abiding Canadians. Mr. Speaker, the countdown is on to the 2019 election. Canadians are eager for a change to a Conservative government. In fact, many are suggesting that this Liberal government lacks the moral authority to govern. It's time for Canadians to come before partisan talking points, Mr. Speaker. It's time to get back to dealing with the real issues in this country. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member for Scarborough-Guildwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my honourable colleague for his speech. I get the overall impression that he's not overly enthusiastic about C-71. Nevertheless, he does make a valid contribution at committee, and I always appreciate his intervention.